Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear youth and leaders, it is a true pleasure to be here today to present a TED Talk, Human Institutions Transforming Societal Systems with Compassion. If I ask you right now what comes to mind when you think about the global systems we're part of and that govern us, such as political, legal, economic, educational systems, I suspect many of your responses would lean towards skepticism or even negativity. As a student and as a young person, it is not an easy time to feel optimistic about the functioning of our international system. It is hard to stay hopeful when seeing the suffering of people in Palestine, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Myanmar, and countless other regions, alongside the apparent immobility of the international community. It is easy to be discomforted when looking at the thousands of refugees living in the streets of Paris during these cold winter nights, relying solely on the solidarity of civil organizations and in the absence of meaningful and structured institutional help. And it is understandable to feel discouraged when these systems appear too rigid and too static to address the complexities of human suffering. And yet, despite all these challenges, the social movement that emerged here at Sciences Po and across the globe reminded us that societal systems at their core should always be about people, about human lives, and about human stories. They reminded us of the importance of collective action as a means to question institutions and to bring fresh perspectives that foster meaningful debate. More importantly, they reminded us that we, the leaders of the present and of the future, have the power to reshape systems that go beyond cold, impersonal frameworks and that embed humanity, empathy, and compassion into their very foundation. Today, we're privileged to hear from someone who shares this human-centric vision. Through her career as a criminal prosecutor, she has shown that justice is not just about enforcing laws, but about fostering societal healing. Her approach reminds us that behind every case there is a human story, and that justice requires always balancing empathy with rationality. She has been part of the Dutch Prosecutor's Office since 2008 and has served as prosecutor since 2017. She has also worked with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and authored the book Crime and Compassion, that explores the importance of centering human interest in legal systems. So, without further ado, I thank you for your attention, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Disa Jironet.
Thank you. Thank you for that poignant and very eloquent introduction, Tommaso. That was beautiful. Thank you. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. I'm so honored that so many of you took time out of your Thursday afternoon to be here and to be together. I really appreciate it. So yeah, I'm Disa. Hi. And I know we've only just met, but I believe that maybe I know something about you already. I think that maybe you're here because you want to do good, and maybe you're here because you want to do good on a large scale. And perhaps you feel motivated to make a change in the world and serve others in a value-driven way. And perhaps you want to create impact, putting humanity at its center. And I think that's something that most of us here in the room have in common, and I think that's something to really cherish. But if that's the case, if that's something we share, then maybe there's something else we share as well. And perhaps it's a feeling of doubt, maybe, like Tommaso said, some powerlessness, maybe. The state of the world at this time bears so much uncertainty, and we face existential threats on so many levels, such as governments with authoritarian tendencies. I'm sure maybe some of you here in this room have experienced that firsthand. For others, it's becoming a looming threat. We are witnessing geopolitical flashpoints with violence as a consequence. And there's so much confusion caused by the disinformation and the virulent hate speech online that's driving us apart further. And maybe you're asking yourself, can I even tackle this? Are the structures in our society resilient enough? Are they still serving humanity? I think on some level you know that if you want to have real impact, you need to be at the center of power. But maybe you're asking yourself, will I have to sacrifice or risk losing my values to get there? And if I want to make any change in such intransigent systems, will I be able to? And are the systems we have even the right ones? So if any of these questions resonate, you're not alone. I think, on the one hand, we might be right in saying that our systems and institutions are outdated to some level. The UN is still subject to the hegemony of the Security Council. The EU is notoriously bureaucratic. Our treaties are still dependent on individual nation states for their implementation. But I think that if we look at their essence, our institutions are perhaps the most important safeguard that we have. And when I say institutions, I don't mean organizations only. I mean the lasting structures and agreements that sort of form the bedrock for how we work as a society and as an international community. Those slow-to-change institutions that form a counterweight to the fast and unpredictable changes of political life. And although the slow pace may be frustrating at times, in the long term, maybe it's something to actually be grateful for. When things are going well, we want the institutions to be more flexible. But when things are going badly, that inflexibility can actually provide some respite. I don't need to tell our LGBTIQ friends in the US that the rule of law is going to be very important for them in the next 4 years. And I don't need to tell people living in flood-prone areas that we need to implement the Paris Agreements as soon as possible. The institutions protect us from short-term political choices. So because I work in one of these institutions, namely the rule of law, I feel the urgency to uphold the institutions more than ever. Especially in my role as national prosecutor combating hate speech and hate crime, I am particularly aware of my role in the second pillar of the Trias Politicas and how vital that is right now. When democracy brings forth a regime that doesn't see that protecting minorities is the only way to provide a safe society for everyone, the rule of law is there to counter that. The institutions add value to a society that is continually being reshaped by temporary political ideas and initiatives, and this is something that I experience on a day-to-day basis in court. But while the slow pace of the institutions can be helpful in hard times, it's not enough in and of itself. The underlying principles form the bedrock, but the way these principles are put into practice is just as critical. There is a choice in how these principles are implemented and how they color our legislation and our policies. And the people working in the institutions, they need to be aware of the power that lies in that choice, in the way you do that. So to fully understand the power of those choices and the implications of those choices, the people working in the institutions need to be able to relate to the people affected by the decisions they make, despite the physical or bureaucratic distance that's often between them. And I think it takes a certain level of self-awareness and compassion to do this, and something that's not always made easy by the way that the institutions are structured. And this is something that I've invested in throughout my career, and something that I'm really honored to be here to share with you about today. So I've been working as a prosecutor for over 15 years, and I've always felt that my job was so much more than running criminal investigations and taking people to court. In my early 20s, I worked at the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. And one prosecutor I spoke to there, she said, "What's the point of my work if I don't explain what I do?" And then later she asked me not to quote it, so I've quoted it. I think she felt maybe it was too contentious to sort of question the intrinsic value of her work. But for me, it really became the motto of my working life. What's the point of my work if I don't explain what I do? And to me, this simple phrase really sums up the interaction between myself, the way I do my job, and the world around it. It implies that justice isn't done in a vacuum, but that there's always an interaction between the justice system and what's happening in society. I became a prosecutor not so much because I like vengeance or putting people behind bars, but because I want to make society safer. And not safe in the sense of like the absence of a few people committing crime, but really safe. The kind of safety that keeps us free. The kind of safety that comes with the faith in legitimate institutions. The kind of safety that comes from being seen and heard. The kind of safety that comes from solved conflicts and long-term healing. So yeah, I was ambitious, idealistic, maybe like you, a bit naive. Because when I began, these kinds of thoughts were so far from the way that things were being done at the prosecutor's office. First of all, the bureaucracy didn't really allow much time to sort of think about these fundamental ideas. We were too busy running with the day-to-day drama of running criminal investigations. And secondly, the culture was really geared towards the attitude more of crime fighters. The ideal prosecutor was tough on crime and maintained a solid distance between himself or herself and the people on the other side of the courtroom. So in the beginning, I tried to adapt my language and my demeanor to that kind of culture. I kept some thoughts to myself. I chose words that fit. I used my toga as armor. But through informal conversations with the people around me, I also found others that shared the same vision and that also dared to look beyond the courtroom. And more specifically, I found people in the leadership that were asking themselves the same questions about safety and about legitimacy. And they fostered these inquirers in me and encouraged me to explore them further. I'm really, really grateful to these people for their candor and their mentorship, because through them, I didn't lose myself in the institution. But that didn't necessarily mean that I could act entirely in line with the values that were underlying those questions. I still felt I had to conform in many ways. And I experienced a palpable tension between who I am as a person and what was expected from me in the courtroom. And I remember feeling like I kept missing something. In court, we only really talk about the evidence and about, whether the defendant has committed the crime. And this is a very sort of technical and legal exercise that's done in a very formal and structured way. And I remember I would look at the defendant and think, you are a whole person. And there's a whole community of people around you also affected by what you've done. Where are you? Where are all of them in this situation? And this tension was often very uncomfortable. And so this discomfort continued for some years until one day something happened and I felt I have to do this differently. And this took place in one particular case that formed the beginning of a decade-long exploration. And the case concerned a domestic abuse situation being tried before a full jury of 3 judges. And the violence was really striking. And because it had been caught on camera, we could all carefully study the details of him beating her with anything within reach. And this was, of course, awful to watch. And the defendant shrank away more and more with each question from the court. The judges wanted to understand what had possessed him. A man with no prior criminal record, and he was timid, closed, and quiet throughout the hearing. And the judges asked him very sort of provocative questions because they weren't getting the answers they wanted. And at that moment, I sat there and I realized this line of questioning isn't going to get us anywhere. And something shifted. And so feeling really frustrated, I decided to try a different approach. So rather than ask him questions about what he'd done, I decided to see if I could ask him questions about who he was. So I calmed my breath, I leaned back a little bit to give him some space, and I asked, when I see these images, I can't rhyme them with the person who's sitting in front of me. Can you please help me understand what happened? And I knew that speaking in this way was out of line, and I saw the judges leaning over, frowning, like, what are you doing? But the man, there was such a sudden shift in the man, and we were all taken aback, because suddenly tears started streaming down his face as his shame made way for sadness. And he told us that he had suffered so much beating as a child that he had no other way to channel his fears of losing his wife. Now, as impressive as this was, it didn't, of course, excuse his actions or provide some legitimation for what he'd done, but it did help us understand his actions better. And this matters. Court hearings, and therefore the rule of law in itself, is not only in place to establish facts or meter out punishment, but it's there to do justice to a person's whole story, where his personal history converges in this crime that he's committed. And this is important so that the institutional and the human don't become two opposing forces. So this case took place some 10 years ago, and it was very important to me for 2 reasons. First of all, it was the first time that I was able to bring that human element into the courtroom using my own self-awareness. Going against the grain of the dominant culture and the structure is always frightening. And it was frightening on that day when I decided to experiment. But the reaction I got from the defendant made me think, if a small change like this, that just the tone of voice that I use, if it can have so much impact, what else can I do? How can I scale this experiment and this experience? And that's then led me to the second reason why it was really important, because it brought me to study the way that these kind of interactions, what kind of impact that has on the people that come into the courtroom, and therefore on the effectiveness of the whole hearing and of the system as a whole, I think. So one victim that I met in court and whom I later interviewed for my first book, Crime and Compassion, she described the hearing as like a form of ritual, like a wedding or a funeral. And it marked a transition in her life from which she could move forward from. And for the first time, she said she felt safe again, because she felt that that she'd been seen and heard, and that because she could sense that her suffering touched us as human beings in the room. And a man that I've had in court, he said that our interaction in the courtroom made him ask himself, for whom do I live this way? A deeply moving question, a very profound question that caused him to choose to live his life with purpose, and he doesn't commit any crime anymore. So with their stories and the hundreds that have followed, I have felt more and more empowered to work through my ideals. Not only because that's in line with who I am, but because I see the transformation that takes place in the victims and in the perpetrators. The courtroom is no longer a cold and transactional place, but a place where we bring our communal suffering. So by working in this way, I believe that we bring the work of the institutions closer to the lives of the people that they serve. And this, I believe, really increases the legitimacy of the institutions. Institutions don't discriminate. They serve everyone equally. And if we do this in a way that allows people to feel seen and heard, they experience that justice is being done. And through my experience and my research, I'm convinced that this creates the kind of safety and trust for everyone, much more than simple law and order ever could. Because it strengthens the foundation under our lives together, rather than only reacting to certain behavior with repression. And I think that this perspective not only has implications for people like me working in the institutions, but for the way we see the institution, what their task and what their value is. So at a time when the world appears to become less and less democratic, with some 70% of the world's nationals now living under autocratic regime, we need mechanisms to protect our fundamental rights more than ever. Around the world, wars and geopolitical tensions are sending people adrift. And here in Europe, the long-festering polarization is crystallizing out in the election of these autocratic regimes. And it goes without saying that this authoritarianism brings with it both fear and instability. And one of the most important things that stands in the way of this happening, I believe, is our institutions. Institutions built to protect our human rights, our fundamental rights for the long haul. And these institutions bring so much needed stability and predictability. And if they are able to relate to the people that they serve, they form a living and adaptable foundation for our society, where polarization has nothing to feed on. Through my experience, I do believe that it is resilient human institutions that will keep us afloat in the trying times yet to come. And I do believe that it is possible to effectuate real, lasting change that will protect us. But these institutions need you, young, intelligent, ambitious young people, and able to vision a kind of future that their current leaders maybe can't see. They need your efforts and your full presence to be able to fulfill their function. Simply having institutions isn't enough. We need human institutions. So here's my encouragement to you. If you feel once you start working in these institutions, if you feel daunted by the size or the intransigence of the organizations, or if you feel alienated or alone, that's real. But don't let that discourage you. Because that feeling that you're feeling alienated, that's a signal that there's more for you to do there, and that your efforts are needed. So find the strength and the patience to stay. Find words to describe your values, something that really touches why you are here. Find other people that resonate with you, and experiment. Because even in the smallest actions, finding that edge of discomfort can really bring an act of rebellion and an agent of change. So that your lives, your careers, can form an expression of your deeper selves. and that will shape the world along with it. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for taking time. Thank you. So, and Tommaso asked me something to do, that you should do something with a QR code. I hope that says enough. Fill something in, have an opinion, that would be great. Thank you again.